The ePortfolios Australia Organising Committee would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and maybe other regions similar to what Australia set up with, and their connection to the land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. If you'd like to acknowledge your traditional or actual owners of the land, please do that through the chat. So I'm going to hand over. We've got three presenters. We've got Christine Slade, who's a Brisbaneite, but for various reasons will be coming in through online. And we've got Sarah and Megan, who are both coming from the US. So it's a really amazing partnership. We're with an organisation, Sarah and Megan are with an organisation called ABLE, and I'm not going to pretend I remember what all the acronyms sounds. They are Association of Alternative Experiential Evidence-Based Learning. I think I've got that right.
Authentic.
So it's an amazing partnership that we have in terms of being able to run these kinds of workshops, but also Christine's involved and a number of our other committee members are involved with ABLE through their research, and that's what we're going to hear about today. All right, I'm going to be quiet and hand it across, so stop sharing. Oops, so yep, just mute and I will do mine, mute mine.
Can everyone see that I'm sharing my screen? Thumbs up. All right, wonderful. Head nods. Great.
Okay, so welcome everyone. It's so great to have such a diverse group of people from different places around the world. And I particularly like this idea of having satellite hubs to not only enhance our blended learning. I guess it causes a little bit of consternation technically, but it's a really great idea for us socially. So Australians, I think, are looking, well, the Queenslanders are definitely looking for face-to-face interaction. So it's enabling people to have different options. So we're very welcome. We've called this webinar Sustainable ePortfolio Practice, Considering Creation, Support and Advocacy. And I hope that'll become obvious to you why we've done that. So we are talking about the principle of visibility of labour, but we felt that it sort of focused on the sustainability aspect for not only perhaps us as academics, learning designers or staff, but also for other stakeholder groups. So I'm Christine Slade, and I actually just work at the University of Queensland. I'm an academic in the Central Teaching Unit, the Institute for Teaching and Learning Innovation. And I am the lead of assessment, but one of my other passions for quite a number of years now has been ePortfolio. So that's why I'm involved with the Australian ePortfolio Forum and also the ABLE Digital Ethics Task Force. And perhaps Sarah and Megan, or we say Megan, but it could be Megan, whichever you prefer. Perhaps you'd just like to say just a little brief bit about what you do.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Sarah Zerhelen, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Writing Across the Curriculum program at Appalachian State University. And I also work in our Writing Center. If you were here earlier, this might be a repeat for some of you, but my time is sort of split in half between doing faculty development with disciplinary faculty who want to use all forms of writing, including ePortfolios, in their classes and want to do so effectively. And then the other half is spent working with writers, some of whom are working on portfolios through the Writing Center. So that's the kind of big picture. And like Christine and Megan, or maybe I'll start calling you Megan, I am on ABLE's task force for digital ethics and ePortfolio use. All right, Megan.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Megan Mize. I am so tickled that we're talking about the pronunciation of my first name because some linguistic colleagues the other day asked me how I pronounce my name. And I said, it's Mize, like size with an M. And they said, no, your first name. And so for a whole day, I couldn't figure out if my name was Megan or Megan. And my parents didn't agree. Both of them said it differently. So my whole life's been a lie. I think I say Megan. Anyway. I am at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, and I am the director for ePortfolios and digital initiatives in our Academic Success Center. I am also English faculty, and similar to Sarah, A large part of my work is working with faculty and administrators to integrate ePortfolio activities into the courses and curricula. And I also oversee a team that is designed on a writing center model or a literacy lab model of ePortfolio assistants who are student peer mentors who help students work with digital media. I think you can guess how busy we were during the pandemic. We were the only student-facing team that touched digital media whatsoever. So really excited to talk about labor and all of that with you all today.
Thank you. So this is just a brief, the overview of the workshop. So it will definitely be a workshop. We're not going to present for the time. So we've already heard from Alison, which is great. And also at the end, we'll hear about some other things that are events coming up for the ePortfolio groups. But now we'll just in a minute give you a brief overview. So what is this ABLE task force? The principles that the task force has designed and refined and disseminated across the sector. We'll talk just briefly about what they are so you can get the picture of where we've been doing for 3 years now. But we want to focus particularly on just this one principle today, which is the visibility of labour. And then we want to sort of put that in an Australian context too, and talk about some other maybe bit theoretical but practical ways of care work, for example, or emotional labour, or ways we can articulate what that might mean for us in our own context where we work. And there'll be case studies to help with that, and then talking about the research project that's on its way. Of course, plenty of time for question and answer. If you have something really urgent, please put it in the chat because there are other people watching and they can let us know if there's something that needs to be talked about right there. Thanks. So we just talked about the principles and that. So if you want to go to this URL, you'll be able to get the materials for what we're going to use today. And you'll need some of that, I believe, for the activities as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I know this sounds very top down and we're not really talking to you about it, but we do want to get into sort of activities and things, but we just are mindful that we need some sort of grounding rules for today. Partly, I guess, because, you know, we have professional lives but maybe we'll be touching a little bit on some issues that are quite personal to us about that professional life or things that we've had going on during COVID. You know, all that work we've had to do to put stuff online and all different things like that. So some people might be sharing something that is really quite sensitive to them or personal to them. So we want to just recognise that that will be the case and that everybody could listen to other people without judgment. I guess we're open to challenge our preconceptions and our biases too. So we'll be needing to be open to feedback from other people. But of course, when you give that feedback, we expect that would be constructive and, you know, we're not going to sort of say something that would be inappropriate for this group, including in the small group. So what was being said here is a confidential, it's a closed sort of group. We don't mind discussing topics in that, but please be sensitive to each other. So
and I wonder, we should have been doing this.
We've already been doing this, yes. That's great, actually. We've had a lot of people come in from while we were waiting from all over the world. I don't know if someone wanted to add up what countries, but I already saw New Zealand and I saw Helen there from US and other people. So it certainly is multicultural. But if you haven't done it already, please introduce yourself to people in the chat. So who are you, where you're from? And we are interested in how you're connected to ePortfolios. Like, we want to be relevant to what you're doing. So if you want to put something there about what you'd like to get out of the workshop, that would be great too.
Absolutely, thanks.
So am I going, keep going?
Yeah, this is the last slide.
Okay, so Digital ethics is a bit of a passion of mine because it relates to so many values and different things, you know, and particularly the ethical considerations that we have for students in my situation and about the nuances of what that would mean. And so it is, when you think about it and boils down, it's about interaction. So it's about ways groups and individuals relate to each other, how they resolve issues, how they treat each other. So we need to be thinking about all the users and participants in online environments and how they interact with each other, but also about the technologies and platforms. So I guess that's the two components. So you know, it's a bit complex because there's lots of things to learn about that interaction with others. But as I know from experience, learning different technologies and platforms also it could be challenging or whatever, but we have to engage with them as well. So that's the context about what we're placing visibility of labour. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christine.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Christine. So with that in mind, this idea of digital ethics and the ABLE community that we referenced earlier, we found over the years that a lot of times practitioners were coming into the field and they might be one or two individuals at an institution who were facing concerns whenever we asked students to do any kind of digital writing that might expose them to risk or data issues of all different kinds of natures. And individuals within institutions would tackle those problems and maybe solve them, come up with different strategies, and then it would go no further, which means someone at another institution might tackle the same issues all on their own. And so over the years at the annual meetings, we started to figure out that maybe we should actually crowdsource this and share our insight, identify what the common issues were, or even the not so common issues, and crowdsource strategies for navigating those. And so that gave rise to the Digital Ethics Task Force, which is now entering its 4th year, I believe. And so if you look here, you can see our shining faces from last year's task force, and we will update this slide now that the new year will kick off here shortly. But you can see that the work became quite immense. There are a lot of ethical issues for us to consider and strategies for us to tackle. And so you can see we have 3 co-chairs, and we've decided to continue that. So I would like to give a shout out to Megan Haskins, who was not able to join us, and Sarah, who is here, and then myself for keeping the same hair color through an entire pandemic, and a wonderful, wonderful team of colleagues from all over, a wide variety of backgrounds. And that's really been important to us and will continue to be important to us moving forward, that there's a diversity of voices and institutional experiences represented. And so after these years of working together, we drafted up a set of principles because we noticed other scholarly entities who would do these very public declarations of kind of best practices or ideal approaches to solving problems. And we felt that these kinds of principles would be helpful to new practitioners, established practitioners, and would really draw on a community of practice in years of experience. And so when we drafted these principles, we decided to have multiple parts. And you can see in the chat, we dropped a link to the principles earlier. So if you would like to look at some of them, you certainly can, and we are going to explore one in depth. But each principle has, drum roll please, animation. Each principle has a statement, which is a brief kind of 1 to 2 sentence declaration of what we think is the ideal scenario for an ethical issue that we are identifying. We then want to move beyond simply pointing at the problem and saying, this is a common problem in ePortfolio practice. We want it to be active. And so we have collected and will continue to collect strategies for different practitioners and different stakeholders to try to address the ethical issue that we have identified. And then also, because we recognize that sometimes issues can be very context specific, we wanted to demonstrate through hypothetical scenarios what this issue might look like for each of the stakeholders. So how would a student encounter issues of data privacy, or what might a faculty member do if they thought material was inappropriately used. And then finally, because it's very important for us to ground all of this in practice and research, for every principle, we offer resources and scholarship. So it's not just simply the task force thinks this is a good idea, but rather we've done the research and drawn on the fields, in-depth work. So if you would, Sarah, thank you. We right now are in version 2 of the principles, and we're actually going to come out with a 3rd version soon, which streamlines them even further. When we first started, we just spent time throwing out every possible issue, risk, conundrum that we could think about, and we had huge eyes. We had proposed something like 25 potential principles, which is very unwieldy. And over time, we realized a lot of these are a Venn diagram. They all overlap or intersect. And so we could find ways to streamline it so that folks could kind of find their way in and make these principles useful to them. And I'm going to do the cardinal sin of reading to you during a presentation, but I think it's important. No, go back. One more. There we go. Thank you, Sarah. I want you to know I appreciate you. I really do. It's tough stuff.
Yeah,
but I
thought you wanted the other one.
Oh yeah, you're good. I just wanted to read the principles to you as they currently stand, so you can see just how different, but also the intersections of some of these concerns. So we have principles that address issues of practice, of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and decolonization. Issues surrounding the efforts to promote awareness of ePortfolio practice, issues around supporting ePortfolio practice, the visibility of labor, issues of evaluating ePortfolios, ensuring accessibility of ePortfolios, privacy issues that are inherent to ePortfolio work, content storage, ensuring access to technology, respecting authors' rights and reuse permissions, cross-platform compatibility, and consent for data storage. And so hopefully, I think you can start to see where some of those will be kind of collapsed and belong together, but also that ePortfolio work has a lot of many vectored concerns that can be teased out and addressed quite directly. Now, if you'll hit the next one. And as you can see, we've highlighted visibility of labor in green, and we love to throw that term labor around so freely. So we'd like to pause because this is a workshop. So we have a small activity. Thank you, Sarah. If you look in the chat, or if you use the QR code or the shortened link, the bit.ly link on the screen, you can access a Padlet. And we would like you to spend just a few minutes answering the first 3 questions on that Padlet. And so the first question is, what kinds of work do you think of when we say ePortfolio labor? And the second question is, what kinds of actions are often needed in order to effectively implement, support, or advocate for ePortfolios? And then finally, what differentiates ePortfolio work from other forms of institutional labor? What makes it unique? So we'll give you a couple minutes and I'll stop talking at you so that you can do a little bit of writing. I see my Gold Star students are on question 4. You do not have to tackle that at this time unless you want to. We will come back. I promise these other questions will crop up. Well, I think let's start discussing some of these, and certainly please continue writing. That activity is in place. And as Tom asked me in the chat, what is a vectored concern? And really, when I say vectors, I just mean lines of inquiry, different paths we can go down when thinking about digital ethics. And as I mentioned in the chat, we see that they can intersect, they can overlap, or sometimes they are worth examining very much in isolation. So for instance, it is really hard to think about support as separate from advocacy, or talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and decolonization and not talk about evaluation and how it's impacted potentially by bias or entrenched notions in relations to grading scales and things of that nature. So, so the principles are often seen as individual lines of thought, but in the task force, we have often seen that they often have to be discussed in connection to one another. So, but today we're going to parse one out. We're going to parse one out by looking directly at labor. And so you all have already started pointing in that direction, that even when we say labor, that can mean many different things to folks. You know, so I see here development of work, a lot of support materials got mentioned in terms of what is specifically e-portfolio labor. People mentioned setting up the technology, helping students identify artifacts or even archiving, curating those. That's work that is often kind of rendered invisible because, for instance, sometimes just saving an artifact for a student may not be awarded a grade or an immediate return on investment. And so a lot of students may not have saving habits because they don't think that work will matter later. Implementation work, which of course we're going to see a lot of talk about training and communication. I really appreciate whoever mentioned going beyond passive learning to metacognition, because that is so key. But also I would say, moving into that next question, convincing our colleagues that metacognition is in fact worth their time to foster among students, and how we do that effectively. Sarah, would you mind popping in on 2, and then I'll wrap up on 3, just so like we kind of don't just do what
Oh,
we
sure. For the for what kinds of actions? Yeah. Well, I mean, so many of these, you know, exactly the action verbs, right? Support, implement, advocate. As you were saying, it's really hard to separate support and advocacy from one another. Somebody identified communities of practice as a space where a lot of that work can happen, which I think is a really great insight. And then maybe alongside, or some ways that happens, right? Coffee chats, department meetings, having academic champions for programmatic implementations, or even maybe college-wide ones. And so I think, and now I'm kind of scrolling down and I'm seeing also demonstrate. Maybe my favorite is focus on the learning and not the software. I think we can get really hung up with the tool and forget why we're using it or the value that it has. And so I think all of these are pointing exactly toward the kinds of work that people do around e-portfolios that sometimes gets recognized and identified as work, but can often remain invisible. Because if, as many of you here are doing this work, you know that a lot of times, you know, sending emails and having coffee with colleagues and reminding people about what's important in student learning and all of those things don't fit really well on a lot of reports that we have to write. They're kind of hard to measure in ways, at least for us, that our universities see. And so that's something that we're really committed to as we sort of take this principle of the visibility of labor and try to investigate it and find ways to support people who are doing this work across our communities. And then there's also pointing towards like the labor for students as well. And I think some of your answers get at that too, navigating the platform, digital literacy, having the time to kind of take to do the design work and those sorts of things. And that actually turns me over to number 3, Megan, because people were talking about design work there.
Yep, absolutely. And I think getting our students to think, you know, composition studies, we would call it multimodal composition. So thinking about media and how they can use multiple forms of communication, when a lot of times they come up through alphabetic writing cultures. Write an essay and you know how to communicate effectively. And I think too, when we look at column 3, what differentiates e-portfolio work, there's a lot of different answers, but I think you see a pattern because effective e-portfolio work has a, you know, it intersects with high impact practices and the criteria that George Koo might give us. So time on task, long, you know, we can see portfolios can move over time. So a student might work on it for years or over the course of a semester. folks might collaborate across an institution on ePortfolio. So you might have your career services team and your technology, your institutional technology team, your librarians, are your writing centers, your academic success center, your faculty, your assessment team, in a way that a lot of activities might not. So students might get feedback from multiple people. Units have to come together to design and support the implementation in a way that is often more complex than perhaps other activities. And I love whoever also mentioned that if you're going to do ePortfolio work, you probably should have built one. And that is a very compelling and common thing I argue to my peers. But even that is work and time to learn an activity, because then you're also practicing empathy, which again is not something that's often institutionally rewarded. So if I'm trying to get tenure, is that portfolio that I'm practicing so I empathize with my students going to help me? Maybe not. Maybe that's not where I invest my time. And so someone mentioned student feedback literacy. I think we see ePortfolios ask students and faculty to learn and exercise several different literacy types, thinking about genre, audience, media use, permissions, all of those things that are kind of inherent to being a good online communicator, but also a safe online communicator. And then asking faculty members to have the literacies that allow them to also scaffold students through that kind of work. So there is more. I think I was scrolling really quickly. I saw contingent. One of my very dear mentors, Shelly Rodriguez, who's at the University of Arizona, once cautioned me not to let an ePortfolio program become a that guy project, in that one person becomes the kind of knower of all things, and then if they leave the institution, the portfolio program collapses. It has to be institutionalized, and that too takes a lot of networking, collaboration, often tying it to assessment. I mentioned in the chat, and please do keep talking to us in the chat, because folks were talking about buy-in, and peers think buy-in happens at the start of initiatives, and I would argue that it happens throughout. It never gets to stop. You have to constantly reconvince people that something is worth investing or expanding. And so right now at our own institution, we're doing a massive assessment analysis to try to show people the value of the kind of work we're doing. So thank you for looking at that. We wanted to at least stop before we moved into talking about labor to make sure that maybe we had a shared language around labor, because as I have already noted, I sometimes say weird things. So if I am unclear in the chat, Christine will, we were joking about a metaphor I love to use, which is rock tumbling. We rock tumble things to polish off the rough edges. So if I say something unclear, just tap me in the chat. All right, Sarah, if you will move to the next slide. Sure. All right, so here I am going to do that cardinal sin of reading to you again, but we wanted to really stop and pause on the actual principle before we try to put it into practice and into conversation. So now we've kind of shared this, our shared perception of what is labor, what is unique labor to ePortfolio work. And so this is a principle that the task force devised. So again, you can see up at the top is our short statement, which reads, the labor required by students, educators, and administrators to create, develop, implement, support, and evaluate ePortfolios should be visible, sustainable, compensated where appropriate, and counted towards evaluation and advancement. And of course, that is a really ideal statement to make. Ideally, those things would be true. And so we wanted to give a rationale. Why do we think this is important for schools and institutions to consider when they're working through ePortfolio implementation? So our rationale is as follows. Learning is invisible labor. Constant shifts in technologies, strategies, rhetorical knowledge, technical skills, genres, and professional expectations require ongoing efforts by all stakeholders. The ability to develop, implement, create, support, and assess ePortfolios requires faculty and staff to have multidisciplinary expertise that should be recognized and rewarded by institutions in which ePortfolio work takes place. And in addition, the intellectual and affective labor and personal risk required of students to learn and employ new platforms, genres, and compositional practices when designing and creating e-portfolios should be recognized and rewarded. So I think this is a really timely principle for us to dig in on, not the least of which next week is Labor Day for us. So that's quite lovely, but also we're seeing an increased discussion of labor and who does which kind of labor. Someone mentioned on the Padlet, where is this housed? Who owns this when it's a collaborative effort often? And that's incredibly important because that inflects the kind of rhetoric that surrounds the value of the portfolio, what the portfolio, quote unquote, does for the students and the learners. But this is our aspirational declaration and the reason why we think this is so important for institutions to take up. And then I think, Sarah, it is over to you.
It is.
Thank you.
And I will talk for just a minute. Thanks so much, Megan. And then we'll get back to our Padlet for those of you who are raring to keep going on those questions. So for this workshop and for some other conversations that we've been having with people about the visibility of labor principle, we found it useful to kind of narrow our focus just a bit, largely because there are so many issues. But one of the kind of underlying ones, or perhaps most invisible, is care work as labor. And so I'm not going to get too much into the history here. On the next slide, which I'll go to in a minute, there's actually a link to a bibliography that if you want to explore more about sort of the background of some of these terms, you can. Christine was saying earlier that emotional labor has been the term that has made the most sense to her, and I think that's fine if you want to think of it that way. Emotional labor was the one that was first identified, and actually in relation to different kinds of workers, but tech workers being one, and the ways that people have to regulate their own emotions and the emotions of others in order to do their jobs well. And from that, it got translated into affective labor. And all of that in the, I think it was the 90s, kind of came about in the defining of this term care work. And I've just listed some features here. But the kind of primary identifying thing of care work is that it is work that is undertaken out of a sense of compassion or responsibility for others, right? And so it's done in support of or service to, and for that reason, historically, it has often been unpaid, uncompensated, unrewarded. Because of those reasons, it's often been very gendered. As we were just saying a moment ago, it's emotional, affective, and more recently has been also attached to intellectual labor. For instance, well, I'll give some examples in a minute. I like to think of it as it's the kind of labor that keeps the world running. It allows all the other things that we see happening to happen. And it's very difficult to document as labor. And anyone who has taken care of an elder parent or family member or a young child alongside them and managed their family in those ways has done care work and is familiar with this practice. But most of us also, in fact, I would argue that everybody here has done it as a student, as a learner, and also as a staff or faculty member, an educator of whatever form you are. So a few examples taken sort of from real life here. For students, a lot of care work happens in the classroom and also in the tutoring space or the consulting space. Might be that you've set aside some class time for students to work on their e-portfolios, and one student notices that their peer is struggling to format photos and captions, and they take the time away from their own work and they take their time and energy to go help that peer. And this would be like not necessarily an assigned sort of peer review time, but they're noticing that to the side. An example of an educator, and I think we saw this actually in the Padlet that people wrote, and this came from a conversation that we had at a computers and writing conference in May in the US. Someone there was telling us her story, Kat McCaffrey, who works with the Global Society of Online Literacy Educators, about how at her institution, she's had to spend a lot of time and energy really insisting to her colleagues that students have access to ethical platforms and that they're taught how to use them in ethical ways, because she's had a really difficult time convincing some of her colleagues that it's not okay to just say, oh, sure, go make a website somewhere and put all of your personal information on it for anybody to glean. And all of that, again, is undocumented labor. It's affective labor in the sense that, you know, she can't sort of get irate at them, because that's not an effective way to get people to do what you want. And so it has all of that emotional tenor to it of care work. And then lastly, and I'm kind of tacking this on as my own argument that I really want to make, but there's care work in the ways that we use technology, right? That there's actually care work built into, or the ways that our technologies work for us. And again, it's the things that we take for granted, but it's the things that take time and pause in order for everything else to run effectively, and make our work as efficient and productive as possible. So things like systems updating, restarting, all of that, there are actually people right in the background who are making this happen, and nobody ever sees it. Same with spell checkers and on the kinds of technologies that we completely take for granted. So that is my just very brief introduction to care work as a type of invisible e-portfolio labor. And you all were already getting at all kinds of others in the Padlet. So I sort of want to go back there for just a moment. So this will take you back to the Padlet to answer the last three questions, which we'll then talk about. So it's the same place we were before. And you can also see on the bottom of this slide, if you're curious, there's a link that will take you to that bibliography of related scholarship for further reading, if that's something you want to explore further. In an effort to attend to the time, I'm going to kind of talk through a few of these. Maybe I'll do what we did before, Megan, and I'll talk for a minute, and then you can hop in for 5. But I think a couple of things that I'm seeing that I'm really interested in knowing more about as we move forward. I mean, all of these, but people have brought up students in really interesting ways. So working with students and partnerships, and the kind of load that puts on students and also staff, that sort of mentoring work, I think is really just a great thing to keep thinking about. How is it happening? Where is it happening? Yeah, exactly. And I'm sorry, I'm seeing the ones that are updating at the very top, and thinking about how something becomes sustainable over time. And I think one person had sort of written, and now I'm trying to go find the comment again, about there's the initial implementation and all the kind of excitement that surrounds that, but then there's the longitudinal nature of it, is I think what becomes exhausting to some people, particularly when you have the casualization of labor in the institution, which I think is something that is happening in all of our settings. And so keeping everybody aware and moving forward and not sort of getting bogged down, I think is a really important thing to think about. Yeah, this comment that e-portfolios are a long game, and to support the longitudinal practice and avoid single point of failure or closed knowledge requires appropriate resourcing. And that actually ties into something that somebody had said in number 3, but and I think Kay said this in the comments, something about keen beans, which I love that expression, but it will often fall to people who are very passionate about it, and it becomes additional work rather than recognized as part of their job. And so I think that kind of takes us over briefly to 6, and then Megan, I'll turn it to you and you can talk about some of the things that you're seeing. But one person had highlighted recording the time spent doing this work, and also somebody had noted about including e-portfolio strategies and institutional teaching, and I think TNL stands for teaching and learning strategies. If I'm reading that incorrectly, please tell me. But the idea that these descriptions might be written into the contracts for the people doing them, right? And so that they can be recognized for doing that labor, and recognized for the contribution that it is making to student learning. Because I think that there's a leap from we're doing the work to we're supporting student learning that sometimes gets missed.
Yeah, and stepping in on some of those comments on 5, which echo comments earlier too, because e-portfolios are so often advocated for as tools for integrative learning, the work of making sure that that integration occurs is really important. We see throughout your comments on relationship building, or networking, or community building. And if you all are anything like us in the US, those networks are wildly in flux right now. People are coming and going and changing roles, which means you're constantly mapping who's in what role and maybe retraining folks. They're bringing in ideas from elsewhere about what portfolios are and might do. So you're constantly also trying to make sure that the missions somewhat aligned between those multiple units and that everyone is getting what they need institutionally for their time. The consistency of support is so key. You know, again, to that point, that people can be really excited at the jump of an implementation, but after you're no longer the new kid on the block, you have to keep that momentum and you have to show that return on investment. And I really appreciated the one in particular about the institutional agendas and goals coming down to staff can miss the affective load that comes with it. And I absolutely empathize with that. At our institution, when we first were asked to do this in full transparency, I was a graduate assistant tasked with flipping a large 4-year university to the e-portfolio programs at that time. And a lot of faculty expressed anxiety to us because of initiative fatigue. Oh, it's another new thing. I'm going to learn this technology. I'm going to learn this pedagogy. Is it going to be here in 4 years, Megan? Is it going to be something else? Or how aligned is it to our strategic plan? Or how important is it to the new president or the new provost? And so the staff are the ones making the arguments for initiatives they maybe didn't even initiate or have time to train in, or have contact with scholarly communities to make sure that they are drawing on best practices and shared strategies. So again, all of that is the kind of work that I think is really important, and thinking too, again, about where it happens at an institution. You know, I know when I mentioned libraries at another meeting, someone said, why would librarians be working with e-portfolios? And it's like, why wouldn't they be working with e-portfolios? It's media literacy. Anyway, so just that kind of pointing out who can help, and maybe how is that time valued, and instead of just being more and just asking people to do it on good faith or do it because they think it's a good idea, and because it makes the institution look good, to have these public facing student testimonials about the impact the institutions had on them, which is of course another thing we have to be careful about, appropriating those messages for our ends, and making sure that the portfolio is really about the student. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much for adding on to that. And I'm going to go to our next slide now, and I want to introduce these questions, and then I'm going to pause and give you 10 minutes to really work on them. And the idea is that you have this chance to write just for yourself. And you can, if you want to focus on a few of the questions, or you want to try to answer all of that, that is completely up to you. You'll notice that some of these are kind of copies of what we were just talking about, but we're hoping that having actually seen what other people were writing may have given you ideas that you hadn't initially considered in your own answers, and might have expanded or stretched the way that you're thinking about some of these terms. We also recognize that as we've made the language jokes before, that we're coming at this with language differences and might be using terms that don't completely translate into your context. And so we're also interested in giving you some time to think through what your terms are, what would work, what would describe or get at some of the things that we're saying here. So initially we're asking about who is doing the work, who is supporting the work. And Megan gave a great little segue there to who's benefiting from this work. And we want to think about, are all of those the same, or where are there differences there? And then we want to think about some of the spaces. Sorry, I just realized we have one question twice. All right. But what modes, strategies, and tools do we have for tracking that? When and where is ePortfolio work happening? And where might be some of the blind spots in the way that we're conceiving of labor that you all might see coming at it from your own context. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and I will bring us back in 10 minutes, and we'll get in breakout groups and talk about some of your responses. I'm going to bring us back now. I hope you've had a chance to answer several of those, if not, maybe not all of them. So we're going to really test the technology here and try some breakout groups. And I think that Allison's going to help us with this part of it. I'm actually going to click on this so that you can see, but what we're asking you to do, and perhaps the people who are face-to-face can be their own breakout groups. And I will get back to our slideshow in a moment, but what I hope I'm showing you right now are our activity instructions. So what we want to do once everybody's in rooms is to choose the slide that is named for them. So you can see group 1 is James Cook University, group 2 is Griffith University, they're named here. And then there's some slides for breakout rooms. And if we need to create more, we'll see how it goes. But what we would like you to do is talk through your answers to the questions and assign someone, or maybe someone will volunteer to help keep the notes so that at the end, everyone will see these and we can kind of all share from the same responses. That's our goal here. If you have questions, you can come back out, I think, into the main room. Again, we've never quite done this before, where some people are in face-to-face breakout groups and some people are in online breakout groups. So we're going to try to run this as smoothly as possible. We'll take about 20 minutes to do this. We'll come back at the top of the hour and have the rest of our time for discussion and Q&A. So that's kind of where we're headed from here. Does what I just explained make sense, Allison? Yes. All right, perfect. Thank you so much. We'll see you all in a little while. Welcome back. As people are coming back, so nice to see all of you. I'm going to share my screen as soon as I figure out how to do it properly again. Great. So you're now seeing my breakout groups. So I wanted to, we want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you did for a few minutes, and also maybe get into some Q&A, and I think it's okay if those things overlap. Now for the end of this workshop. I first just wanted to say thank you so much. I was able to look through some of the slides as people were writing, and there's just a ton of great material there. I was in the breakout group with the Deacon group, and we were talking about how maybe the best way to go about sharing this information with all of you later will be to kind of summarize everyone's responses under the questions and share it out that way. So there's no danger of identifying anybody who doesn't want their responses to be identified. So we'll plan to do that. And also, I would like to maybe just open the floor for people who wanted to share what their group talked about, maybe specifically focusing on some of the strategies that you might have shared with each other that might be useful for others to hear, in terms of what are maybe some modes or tools or just ideas that you've had at your own institutions or in your own experience. Jeffrey, I know we're not all at higher ed institutions, for recognizing the labor that you're doing, but also maybe that your students or that your ePortfolio creators are doing. Yeah, so I'm going to open up to that, and just a reminder that you are in the main room, so this part is being recorded for other people to listen to later. Yes, Christina. You might be muted.
God, sorry again. Hello again. Our breakout room, and I'm not sure, Sarah, if you want to go to the slide so that it's easier for people to read what we have written while I'm summarizing it. We were slide 5, group 4, breakout room 1. And in there, it became apparent quite quickly that ePortfolio work is quite labor intensive. and that there's lots involved, lots of people involved, especially if you look at who's supporting the work of portfolios. There's, of course, always overlap in who's doing the work and then supporting the work, but that there are definitely more people supporting the e-portfolio work at different levels. And that also influences when the e-portfolio work happens. So with that question, we weren't actually quite sure what was meant with when it happens. And so we have two solutions there. One is kind of during the sort of work you do, internships, assessment, recognition of prior learning, career planning. But then on the other hand, we were also looking at it more in a temporal sense. And it became quite clear that there's a lot of after hours work happening for academics, including weekends, kind of setting up platforms, finalizing things, getting everything online, but also for students in terms of when they can actually update their portfolio, because when they are on placement, for example, they are supposed to work during a placement. And so all that updating, reflecting happens after they finish that work, and therefore lengthening the work days and being quite labor intense. Yeah, that's, I think, is the main takeaway from our conversation there in a way. And so I'd love to hear what other people have gathered for all of those.
Hello, hopefully you can hear me. Let me know in the chat otherwise. Hopefully.
I'm seeing.
Yes, great. So in terms of some strategies, we talked a bit about some of the mapping and visualization things that various people use, but then also just, I guess, in terms of recognizing the way that e-portfolio practice may be embedded across a program, you know, and typically that kind of work happens project-based and in stages, which means that sometimes by the time you've kind of finished doing that first round implementation, it's already time to start, you know, it actually needs to be reviewed and improved upon or reiterated in some way to, you know, make the pieces all fit together, and, you know, and just to take feedback on board. And also just that, you know, there are other things that may need to be changed as far as, you know, subject outlines or, you know, course outlines or handbook information, because you might be changing assessments, things like that. There may be things around accreditation that come into play. And so one thing that we haven't really, it would be great if there were opportunities to kind of feed into those accreditation processes long term, so that that work kind of happens, you know, at least the conceptualization and some of the planning happens at the point where that work's already getting reviewed and redesigned anyway, you know, because otherwise it's potentially sort of coming at points where people don't, you know, have the ability to change things, or they can, but it's going to be 6 to 12 months down the track.
Or it gets viewed as an add-on and an additional thing, rather than something that's inherent within the way we teach and our students learn.
Yeah, or again, it's maybe done sort of in pieces rather than holistically. So there's opportunities there to maybe look at where e-portfolios fit in that, you know, in those course accreditation processes or programmatic accreditation processes.
Yeah, I love that idea so much. Thank you all for sharing. I think Pauline.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Look, I just thought I'd share a couple of things that stood out when I was talking to Alan. Alan works in a VE institute in New Zealand. And, you know, one thing that really kind of came out of our conversation was the difference of how places work when you've got the strategic buy-in and the non-strategic buy-in, you know. So I work with, from PebblePad, so I work with a number of different institutions, some who have really great support. They've got a strategic vision, they've got great project teams who are setting it up, and they move it on to BAU, you know, so it works really well. There's a proper support, you've got your designers there, it's, you know, set into in a programmatic way. You've got the whole employability and will teams buying into it, where they're documenting graduate attributes, etc., as they're growing, all those wonderful things. And then you've got the others who've kind of adopted it because they had to. Maybe industry said you have to adopt this because we need this for our accreditation. We need to see the capabilities documented in an auditable way. And that some have adopted it in a way that, oh, well, it's just for those programs, but they haven't looked at the big vision, and they haven't looked at how can we make this really exciting, a wonderful learning tool for all students, where they are using that metacognitive process to learn and to reflect on their learning. And it's really sad when that happens. Without the strategic buy-in, you're really relying on individual amazing educators, like a lot of the people in this room now, to actually make it happen. And that doesn't necessarily work. Something else that came out of our conversation with Alan was about his students are they're from low socioeconomic background, don't have computers at home. That makes it very difficult. So they do put a room aside, they book a room for students to be able to use, but when they're at home, it's very difficult to do that. So we talked about using tools, something like, the Pebble Pocket app, where people can record their thoughts on their phone, and then when they're back online again, it will pop in. So having good tools is also a really good option for students with difficulties in their lives, I suppose. So just a couple of things I wanted to point out that stood out to me.
Yeah, thank you. I think the last one you were talking about points specifically to one of our principles about access to technology. It is something that we've thought a lot about. So I'm so glad that you all had that conversation. Michael, and if you could, I think I guessed on Pauline's and I might have been right, but if you could tell me what slide to point to, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Ours is slide 9.
Oh, great.
I am with Ross and Rocco, and thanks to Ross for jotting down notes for our group. I am Michael from the Philippines, and I belong to St. Mary's College of Maykawayan. We share, the three of us, that ePortfolio has not yet launched in our respective institutions, but I kind of share mine because due to my attendance to various ePortfolio webinars from different countries, most especially in the CIMEO project, I've got so much interested beginning last school year. So the learnings which I got from the session of Dr. Christine Slade and others, I brought it in my institution last year, one by one, the context of assessment, evaluations, writing, everything. I place it one by one. And so this coming September 2022, we will be launching our ePortfolio program for our faculty and students. The focus for the faculty mainly is on knowing if what we have designed as a teaching strategy for this blended learning setting in the Philippines, particularly in our school, will become effective in their delivery of the instruction. So we will not be asking so much of quantitative evaluation. Instead, we'll be asking for reflections about their experiences on that. And with our students, we are embedding it in our on-the-job training, practical training, so that we will know their experiences in their work environment. So in terms of how did we try to integrate those things so as not to make it an additional work for them, we integrated it in our programs as what was mentioned a while ago. We just integrated the assessments, evaluations, and writing down of the reflections in our current programs. And in fact, last year when I learned things about the different platforms, that it's just click and drag, you type text, you paste photos and videos, we introduced it one by one last school year. And so I am very much excited to launch it this coming September 2022. We'll be asking for your prayers for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Congratulations. That's a lot of work, but it sounds like you're moving in a really exciting direction. Katie, slide 6 or group 6, I think you said.
Hi. It was yep. Oh, hang on. Group 6 breakout. No. Oh, yes, that's us, I think. Who's doing the work? We have at La Trobe University a huge uptake of PebblePad. I think we've got current users this year at a sort of 25,000 online. So, and we did very much have initially a lot of support in at school level with the reduction of staff numbers during the pandemic. It has been sort of re-centralised. We do have a centralised learning design team around tech enhanced learning. And we also have a tech support group that support ongoing. So we have the sort of build design beginning and tech support for sort of ongoing issues. Oh, no, maybe that's not our slide. Is there another group 6 there?
Maybe
No,
it was
just
breakout room 6.
Yes, sorry.
Okay. No, you're fine.
Katie, I think that is our slides.
Oh, I thought we had more in there. Sorry.
Oh, we did. It hasn't saved. We did
Yeah.
have more.
Yeah, we had a lot more in there.
More.
Oh, what a shame. What a shame.
about
Anyway, yeah, so again, supporting is at sort of a very central, although we are very fortunate that every time we reach out to PebblePad, they're always very willing to support and meet with us in a consulting sort of way, and also to connect us to other institutes doing very similar, where schools align and so forth. We've got, a couple of sort of new ones that we're looking at doing. Who benefits? Well, clearly the students benefit, but I think the academics also benefit from the sort of streamlining of assessments and the visibility of students' progression, and being able to pick up at-risk students instead of sort of getting to the end of the semester and having a placement workbook come in that, and it's empty, or there's not something in there that's going to get the student across the line. Modes and strategies. At La Trobe, we actually use an app, ServiceNow, which tracks all of the incoming sort of tech support requests, but we're also using it to capture design builds, and that enables us to, one, identify the hours that are being spent, but also the areas of support. So if we can see that there's a repetitive need or something that is a challenge across academics, then we can actually establish a workshop and deliver a workshop to address that need. When ePortfolio work happens, when I was considering this, I was sort of thinking about it across the year, and it is very consistent across the year, but it does sort of peak pre-semester with wanting a new solution or wanting assistance and maintenance with a rollover, etc. And where, again, it's interesting because we were sort of just, well, it happens online, and but you're right, there's obviously a lot of considerations around, when it happens out in placement and it happens in a work environment. There's sometimes an issue accessing tech or completing stuff. But we do actively sort of come up with, Pebble Plus has, PebblePad has Pebble Plus and the mobile aspect of it, so that helps. As far as blind spots go, we've got an interesting time at La Trobe because we have fairly new management in at a level who regularly just say to us, oh, well, create a process, create an article, create a template, and that, done and dusted. And it's like, well, no, because every time you meet with an academic or a different school, the uniqueness of each case and each situation is very different. So what we have done is we are creating templates and processes and using those as a base of build and being able to then customize a solution specific to the needs and the outcomes. So.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm sorry that the slide didn't save everything, but I don't know if you saw Allison wrote in the chat. If it's on your side and you can send it to her, we'll make sure that all that gets included.
No, there was just one point of adding. So we chatted about it and Jackie grabbed it all. So
wonderful. Awesome. Okay, great. That's great.
But yeah, didn't show there. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all so much. There were a ton of great suggestions here. And we'll make sure to get all of them put together and shared out with everyone. I'm going to go back to the slideshow now because we have about 11 minutes left. And I just want to make sure that we have time to do a few other things. And I'm going to turn it over to Megan for this slide.
Thank you, everyone. That was really quite fun. We always enjoyed that portion of these exercises, getting to talk to folks individually and then hearing it in a group. Because I think we see a lot of divergences, but also very common trends amongst our work. And one of the things that we undertook when we became the task force and created these principles is that we just didn't think it was enough to advocate for those things. We feel like we needed to put them into action. And so, of course, we tackled the visibility of labor principle first, and we currently have a research project where we're attempting to map the work that is often anecdotal, are contained within universities and college silos. And so these narratives that we've all just kind of shared, these concerns, these different approaches, a lot of times as a field, we just don't know that those experiences are out there. So often we hear people say they feel lonely. They're the only one or two people doing that work or advocating. And so we created the ePortfolio Mapping Project. At this time, the first version of that mapping project was released at the recent ABLE annual meeting. It currently only focuses on the US and Canada, but that is not because we think anyone is less valuable. Our second version of this is about to come out hopefully at the end of this next year. Our next phase is to create one for Australia and New Zealand. And part of that was because we found enough distinctions between terminologies and the way, for instance, Americans do things and other audiences might not. So we wanted to make sure that the surveys were really targeted to the stakeholders that they were attempting to map and capture those experiences. So we hope you will be on the lookout for a version for you all here soon. That everything you shared with us is so valuable and such a part of the field, and we really want to make sure that we make that labor visible in a series of reports and then sharing strategies that folks are using to navigate those experiences.
All right, just a few more things, and if you're following along on our slideshow, you have links to all of this stuff. Christine, would you like to wrap us up here? Or I can do it if you don't want to.
Oh, no, I'm fine. So we have regular webinars for the principles, for the digital ethics principles, and that's just links there to the accessibility one and consent and privacy, which I believe I'm actually doing that one in December. I'm not sure, the task force scholarship, so that link is to all the publications, resources and things that we've actually put out over the past 3 years. So that will be there for you. And I was just wanted to comment on the previous slide briefly about the Australian and New Zealand survey. So it's right, we want to get the terminology right and the questions right for our own context. And that's one of the things that I've been helping with on the task force. And I will when it actually is ready for us to go, I will definitely tell Alison. So ePortfolios Australia will be the connection point when you'll know that that will be available. And we would really appreciate if you have time or the desire to actually complete that survey so we can understand more of our context.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry my computer just decided to put itself to sleep for a second.
I think we're nearly at the end, and I think Alison just had a couple of things perhaps to advertise. Yes. Oh,
yeah, well, we just want to do a couple of things real
Yes.
quickly. Well, I will do them incredibly quickly. We already talked about this, but we are starting in our 4th year for the task force. If you are interested in joining us, you can apply here. The deadline is coming up quickly, but we are always interested and having participation from people who work in all kinds of different scenarios and situations. So you don't necessarily have to be in higher education. Your connection to e-portfolios can vary widely, but we would love to have more opinions there. And then we'll just throw a couple of slides in the chat, but we always would love to get your feedback. We have a short survey that we ask people to take. I'll try to get that thrown in the chat. And then the last slide is just our contact information if you would like to get in touch with us. And I will now turn it over to Alison.
So as you can see from the couple of hours we've been together, both in room here and at Deakin and all of you online, there's been a lot of work been done, bring the workshop together, but also a lot of stuff been happening even before the workshop comes together. So if you don't mind, please, in some way through the chat or there are the lovely reactions and so forth, please show your appreciation to our three presenters and people behind them who are the invisible labour to make sure that this workshop comes together with all of the information and so on. So please show your gratitude through some digital form online. And we'd like to thank you from Griffith University. Beautiful. So while we're doing that, I would also like to just do some quick plugs of some of this information, if you're online's in the calendar invite if you want the links. We've been running something that was originally called Shut Up and ePortfolio. We thought it was probably a little bit aggressive. And so we've come up with Plan, Act, Reflect and ePortfolio. So they're 90-minute sessions. There's a bit of discussion at the beginning, a bit in the middle and a bit at the end, but basically it is sacred time for you to work on your ePortfolio. Somebody advocated either in room or online that really, if we're advocating ePortfolios, where are our ePortfolios? And so making sure that you're practicing what you preach. So Kate and Heather are going to be facilitating that. So they're Australian timelines that we're giving here, Sydney, Australia, or Melbourne, Australia. We're having, as I mentioned before, our dual delivery, our kind of the crown jewel of what we work hard for all year is our forum. It's a 2-day forum. And it'll be really exciting because it'll be something similar to today where it will be dual. We'll have people from all over the world presenting, as well as breakout rooms, etc., as well as in-house down at the University of Melbourne. We are also on the socials. So if you're on Twitter or Facebook, please follow us on one of those or connect with us on one of those. We've been doing ePortfolios Australia as what I call a true community of practice since 2012. We have a lot of assets. There's some work going on in the background and a subgroup to try and bring those assets together in a way that's much easier for people to access, but distributed across the website, the ePortfolios Australia website. There's a lot of recordings and slides and stuff. So please use that website as a resource until we get it a little bit more coordinated. If you've got any other ePortfolio activity happening, so whether it's at a local base or at a national or a regional base, please share it with us. That's really the best way to get other people interested, is when they can see the activity. When we're very abstract, it's a very hard concept for people to get. I've been talking about this, my kids were laughing because I said I'm off to do an ePortfolio thing. They still don't understand what I mean. So wherever possible, share what's happening with you locally, with what's happening in your institution, share it publicly or share it through us, and let's make sure people do understand what the power of an ePortfolio process is. So that's our, we're also on Facebook in terms of the community practice group, so please make use of that. And I do need to recognise, just like the presenters, there's a group about 15 plus of us on the organising committee that bring together these types of events. I would like to acknowledge the efforts and in particular Marlene and Joe and Kate in Melbourne for enabling us to have this dual delivery. I think I'm nearly there. Oh, if you would like to be involved and help us in any kind of way. So on our organising committee, we have people who are nearly every meeting that we run. It's usually every 2-3 weeks. We have a meeting from February through to about late November. We have people who just put their hand up when we need peer review papers to be done. So we never see them live. So occasionally they might come to an event and so on. So if you're interested in helping in any way, in smallest, biggest way, then please just let us know. So I think, pretty sure that's it. So thank you so much. I can't see the time. I think we're dead on time. Yes, we are. Perfect. Dead on time. So thank you so much for people to come in. We love it if you can stay and have a chat. Your time permits. Otherwise, thank you so much again to Sarah, to Christine, and to Megan for and for the people supporting them for such a motivated session. So I'll wrap it up from here and see you next time.